Hey there, and welcome to the House of History, where we take a crack at mystery through, you guessed it, history. So, in today's lessons plan, before we get started, we will be addressing United States history, continuity and change in the 20th century, as delineated in California State Standard 11.9 number 3. By analyzing United States foreign policy towards Latin America since World War II and the effects that it has had both for the US and for its southern neighbors. And if all goes well, we'll be able to take hold of our knowledge and apply it to today's overarching US foreign policy. For you know what they say, one who doesn't know their history is doomed to repeat it. Repeat. So before we move ahead, I just want to place kind of a scale of importance about how important it is to understand that what can happen when a country intervenes in a region without the proper contextual understanding. Yes, that was not fiction. In fact, that was a very close possibility during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 between the United States and Russia when ballistic nuclear missiles were placed in Cuba. It was the closest the world has ever come to the brink of destruction. And that's why it is that important for us to understand the cultural context of other countries during intervention. But before we get to that, we need to do a quick overview. So U.S. policy in Latin America really begins with the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was signed and kind of was the direction that the U.S. was going to take regarding foreign policy with Latin America, beginning in the 1820s. It was signed in by James Monroe, but it was written by John Quincy Adams. And really, the extent of it was they wanted to assert themselves as the sole controllers of the Western Hemisphere. However, this was not yet possible due to strong European influence, and the United States was just beginning to get itself on its feet. But as time continued, European influence kind of drifted away from Latin America, and the United States established itself and asserted itself more and more in the region. This continued with the Roosevelt Corollary, where Teddy Roosevelt made an issue to the European countries that they do not want any influence, especially with countries who were owed large debts by Venezuela and La República Dominicana. So the impact of this is basically that the U.S. becomes a police power of the Western Hemisphere. This continues forward with the dollar diplomacy, in which President Taft put into action, and basically the plan was to increase American investments in the region. And to do this, one of the main foreign policy objectives was the U.S. attempting to protect its interests, its business economic interests. But again, this was not the United States government who had these investments, it was American corporations. And the final aspect of our overview is the Good Neighbor Plan. And the Good Neighbor Plan was really introduced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really believed that relations with Latin America were suffering and that it needed to be improved. So he made it a point to intervene, to remove many of the troops stationed through Latin America, to pull troops back, and to give more independence and sovereignty to Latin American nations. And this really saw an increase of trade and relations between the two areas. So now, but really, how deep was the United States intervention in the Latin American region?
1898, President McKinley orders U.S. troops to invade Cuba. 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt orders the invasion of Honduras. 1912, President Taft orders the invasion of Nicaragua. 1914 to 18, President Wilson invades Haiti, Cuba, and Panama. 1924 to 26, President Coolidge invades Nicaragua and Honduras. 1954, Eisenhower approves the overthrow of the elected government of Guatemala. 1961, Kennedy approves a CIA invasion of Cuba. 1965, Johnson invades the Dominican Republic. 1973, Nixon approves the overthrow of the elected government of Chile. 1981, President Reagan approves the CIA secret war against Nicaragua. 1983, President Reagan orders the invasion of Grenada.
Wow, so definitely we saw that was a lot of intervention in Latin America. And that wasn't even capturing all of the intervention. But we immediately have to ask ourselves why. Well, once we ask ourselves why, we need to understand the United States context. So for the past few decades, the United States had risen in rapid growth and in power and influence. Especially after World War II, the United States had become a world superpower, the leader of the free world. As part of this also, it was the desire to promote capitalism and democracy. There was a wave of communism that had existed in the 20s and the 30s, and there was a great fear inside the nation that there's communist subversives who were trying to take down the very essence of America. And after World War II, the United States was in a Cold War, pitted against the Soviet Union. So the United States, which stands for democracy, capitalism, freedom of expression, and the right to own property, came into clash with this idea of communism, whereas communism is very much opposed to the ideals of capitalism. Communism dictates that no such thing as private property should exist. Ultimate power lies in state-run enterprise in the state itself, and there's very limited amounts of freedom of expression, liberty, freedom of speech. So the United States really found itself in an ideological war with the Cold War, with the Soviet Russia, and that played out in a myriad of ways, as we will see in Latin America.
I believe my team is in agreement. If we permit the introduction of nuclear missiles to a Soviet satellite nation in our hemisphere, the diplomatic consequences will be too terrible to contemplate. The Russians are trying to show the world they can do whatever they want, wherever they want, and we're powerless to stop them. If they succeed,
it'll be Munich all over again.
Yes, appeasement only makes the aggressor more aggressive. And the Soviets will be emboldened to push us even harder. Now, we must remove the missiles one way or another.
Now, the scene you just saw was from the movie 13 Days. And basically, the movie covers what historically happened as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was 1962, and Soviet Russia had implemented over 4 dozen nuclear ballistic missiles in the country of Cuba, pointed towards the United States. This led to huge fear for the United States, as they saw it as an act of aggression. However, Soviet Union and Cuba claimed it was more of self-defense. And it must be explained that the United States also had nuclear ballistic missiles placed in Turkey, aimed at Russia. But the reason I show this clip and discuss the Cuban Missile Crisis is to show how strong the fear of the American public and the American government was of Soviet Russia, which they called the Red Dog. And there were instances in which this obsession and fear of the Soviet menace were legitimate, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the closest the world ever came to annihilation. But due to this obsession, many American foreign policy directors failed to understand the historical economic conditions of Latin America and to understand that it is different than Soviet Russia.
Say nothing, do you, Admiral? This is not a blockade. This is language, a new vocabulary, the likes of which the world has never seen. This is President Kennedy communicating with Secretary Khrushchev.
So to show the Latin American context, I have gathered this quote by U.S. Senator J. William Fulbright in a speech to Congress on United States policy in Latin America. This quote does a very good job of capturing really what was going on with Latin America. Most Latin Americans have seen their neighbor to the north, the United States, growing richer. They have seen the elite elements in their own societies growing richer. But the man in the street or on the land in Latin America today still lives hand-to-mouth existence of his great-great-grandfather. They are less and less happy with situations in which, to cite one example, 40% of the land is owned by 1% of the people, and in which typically a very thin upper crust lives in grandeur, while most others live in squalor. Latin America during this time suffered from tremendous inequality, as the legacy of colonialism bred an institutional oppression of many of the region's peoples. This all changed post-World War II as the consciousness of the inequitable power of oligarchies, such as in El Salvador, and dominance by corporations such as the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, and corrupt autocratic leaders such as Batista in Cuba and Somoza in Nicaragua, caused a hemispheric push for a more dignified means of living. In almost all cases, though, these peaceful movements were crushed with a hard hand, pushing many into armed revolution. The United States supported the status quo. The atrocities occurred everywhere. El Salvador saw over 70,000 people killed, Guatemala over 220,000 killed, Argentina's 30 War over 30,000 killed, Nicaragua's revolution over 30,000 killed. In Chile, over 3,000 were killed, and the list goes on. But what can we learn from this? It is important to understand certain national movements and revolutions are the desire of the native people. Certain ideologies cannot be imposed upon others. Despite the mass destruction that occurred all over Latin America, today many of the revolutionary movements are empowered today, despite long bloody struggles, such as in Cuba, the FMLN in El Salvador, Maduro in Venezuela, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, former rebel presidents of Uruguay and Brazil, Cel Mujica and Dilma Rousseff. But it is important to note that the United States was acting in its own contextual understanding. But for future foreign policy, it must be avoided to make such costly and difficult objectives. So that is today's mystery solved through history. And finally, for the moment you've all been waiting for, tonight's homework assignment will be a 2-page report on applying what we've learned today in current world U.S. foreign policy and where can similarities and differences being drawn to with the U.S. and the Middle East. Thank you.
Whenever you're working in the social sciences, especially with history and politics, it's very important to always keep an open mind, but a mind that's very inquisitive and full of questions. Don't take everything that I will share with you today as certain truth, but definitely take this new perspective, ask questions about it, do more research about it at home, and then through that constant critical thinking and analysis, that's how history becomes alive.